Mark Twain once said that there was only two certainties in life, death and taxes. However, to reflect the 21st century, I'd like to add another one to the mix, Greek debt crises. See, while everyone's been looking at the upcoming European elections and distracted by the ongoing antics of the new Trump administration, a new crisis has actually been brewing in Athens. Now, I know what you're thinking. Didn't Greece just have a bailout? And the answer is yes. But that doesn't change the fact that between now and September, the Greeks need to pay back about 23 billion euros worth of debt, and they'll run out of the cash to do so in roughly July. Which is why the Greek stock market is at its lowest level since 1989 this week. The issue is with Dutch, French and German elections just around the corner, delaying any resolution now could be incredibly painful down the road, which is why, although it doesn't look like it, a solution with this week would be the best outcome for all. So here's the state of play. The Greeks and the Europeans, predominantly represented by the European Stability Mechanism, pretty much have agreed to a deal. Essentially, the Greeks have to maintain for the next 10 years a budget surplus of 3.5% of GDP before interest repayments. Additionally, the Greeks have to implement a privatisation fund which they've already agreed to in the past and have never gotten around to doing. Turns out being broke and unemployed is pretty time consuming. However, in this particular circumstance, it takes three to tango. See, the Dutch and the Germans are insisting that the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, is involved in the deal. However, unfortunately for them, the IMF have demands of their own, and those demands aren't exactly ones that anyone seems to like. The IMF says targeting a surplus of 3.5% of GDP is frankly unrealistic, and believe that the target should be about 1.5%. But more importantly, it has key demands from Athens, including increasing its tax base, cutting pensions, and a greater effort to privatise key sectors. The IMF particularly points out that Greece spends the equivalent of about 15% of its GDP on pensions, nearly double the average of other advanced economies. As a result, the Greeks are more than happy for the Washington-based institution to stay on the sidelines. And as a result of the demands that they have from the Europeans, the Germans and the Dutch might come to a very similar conclusion soon. The IMF's key demand from the Europeans is debt restructuring, essentially tearing up a significant portion of Greek debt, or at least altering the bond's maturity and interest payments for a great period of time. Because, as you can see from this chart here, without debt restructuring, the IMF is arguing that Greece will simply become the world's largest debtors colony, and as a percentage of GDP, Greek debt will actually increase in the future instead of reduce. Now this is where the politics gets interesting, because the best case scenario is that this is all resolved in the next week, as Dutch elections are just 4 weeks away. However, the chances of that are quite unlikely. See, the best option is that the IMF just folds, but the IMF has no incentive to agree to the deal between the Europeans and the Greeks, and essentially rob itself of power. So the next best option is that the Dutch and the Germans walk away from their demand that the IMF participate, but that would be politically quite difficult to do, especially for the Dutch, when the main anti-establishment party, the Freedom Party, looks like it's going to gain the most amount of seats in just 4 weeks' time. So the third and most likely option is that the can just simply gets kicked down the road into the heart of the German campaigning season. A political nightmare for Angela Merkel, as she faces an incredibly tough re-election bid with threats from both her left and her right. As usual, there's no good options when it comes to dealing with the Greek debt crisis, but some are certainly better than others. Unfortunately, the best ones are also the ones that are least likely to be pursued. Thanks for listening to Black Swan Politics. Don't forget to subscribe.